All right, welcome back, everyone. So my name is Angela Key, and I am one of the rare book librarians here over at Becker Library. And we hope that people enjoy the refreshments and chance to peruse the gallery exhibit. Our rare books, of course, have plenty to say on how medical ideas traveled around the world, and we're happy for a chance to highlight our East Asian books of medical history. So we are excited to have Dr. Susan Brownell here today to continue today's discussion about medicine, surgery, and ophthalmology in East Asia. Dr. Brownell is a curator distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis and is known for her work on China sport, the Olympic Games, as well as World's Fairs. Her first book, Training the Body for China, Sports in the Moral Order of the People's Republic, drew on her experience as a national champion collegiate athlete in China. She is the author of Beijing Games, What the Olympics Mean to China, co-author of The Anthropology of Sport, Body, Borders, and Biopolitics, and has published multiple works and commentaries about China and sports. She was awarded UNCLOS Chancellor's Award for Research and Creativity in 2015. Her talk, Oriental Eye, Anthropology, Ophthalmology, and Surgery, will discuss cosmetic eye surgery and the emergence of the link between eye shape and race in anthropology and ophthalmology. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Brownell.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. This is an unusual audience for me. I mean, you guys might know how to pronounce some of these vocabulary words better than I do, so, forgive me. But so basically the start of this talk was me doing ethnographic fieldwork in China in the 1990s. And since the start of the reform era in 1978, cosmetic surgery had gone from nearly non-existent to national obsession. The first thing to appear sort of on the horizon was beauty salons, and then they were rather quickly followed by cosmetic surgery clinics in the 1990s. So I conducted fieldwork on cosmetic surgery in Beijing between 1995 and 2004. And one of the things I did was I collaborated with Dr. Zhang Shen, a young and rising star in cosmetic surgery circles in Beijing. And I spent half days at his small cosmetic surgery clinic. And I also interviewed Song Ru Yao, who was the founder of the Beijing Bada Chu Plastic Surgery Hospital, which at that time could still be, but at that time it was the largest plastic surgery hospital in the world. And I talked to their nurses, women who had had eyelid surgery and everyday people who hadn't had eyelid surgery, and collected tape recordings of radio talk shows on cosmetic surgery. I interviewed executives and models working in the fashion industry. And what I found was that by far the most common surgery was eyelid surgery, and it was just sort of becoming an obsession in China. So that was the phenomenon I studied. I have been an expert on Chinese sports. This was going to be like my second big research topic. I got halfway towards a book when Beijing started bidding for Olympic Games, and I got sucked back into sports and I never wrote it up. So what you see today is like kind of old research, which I've updated a little bit. Like last time I gave a talk was maybe 10 years ago, and so it's a little bit outdated and things could be different now. I did try to catch up on a few things before giving this talk. So Westerners typically view eyelid surgery as ethnic surgery, in which Asians are imitating the shape of European eyes and trying to erase their racial identity. Asians, however, typically deny this. They argue that larger eyes are more emotionally expressive and they're more beautiful. Western feminist scholars typically argue that Asian women who undergo cosmetic surgery have internalized a sexist and racist ideology. They say this even though they know that surgeons and patients deny that eyelid surgery is Caucasianization. And I also found in my research that surgeons and patients denied it. Many actually gave medical reasons for surgery, and since trachoma came up earlier, I'll just mention that entropium, or inward turning eyelashes, was often given as a medical excuse for why I needed cosmetic eyelid surgery. And I wonder if there's a little something to look into there, because although the Song Ru-ya, Dr. Song, the cosmetic, one of the founders of cosmetic surgery, told me that trachoma is or was very common in China. And then fast forward to the fact that recently I did start another project, which is looking at Chinese immigrants in the Mississippi Delta. And so I've been looking at immigration manifests during the era when Chinese were officially sort of excluded from immigrating to the US. So 1882 to the 1940s, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and laborers were banned from coming in, but merchants, students, and diplomats could enter. So they were doing their hardest to keep Chinese out. And there was a list of diseases that physicians would look for when new immigrants arrived in San Francisco or Seattle or wherever. And if they had it, they would put them on the boat back to China. And trichiasis was one of them. It was like horrible and degenerative diseases. You know, there's a label like that in the list. So I don't know, maybe there's something there about disability too. Maybe they didn't want blind Chinese people coming into the US. I should look into that. Anyway, even when the reasons were acknowledged to be cosmetic, both patients and non-patients we usually deny that surgery was an outright attempt to look European or Western. And for example, a young female nurse in the cosmetic surgery clinic told me, after the operation, some people truly are beautiful. Their eyes are bigger. And I asked her if they were trying to imitate Europeans, and she said, no, this is human nature. They just like bigger eyes. So in an attempt to resolve the contradiction between what East Asian patients say eyelid surgery means and what Western feminists say it means, I decided to look into the history a little bit and trace the genealogy of eyelid surgery back. I didn't know it was going to lead there, but it turned out it led back into the history of my own discipline, anthropology. And I discovered that in the 19th century, anthropology had a close relationship with the field of medicine, which I actually didn't previously know. And both fields were permeated by the same bad pseudoscience of race. So this research revealed this bad pseudoscience that produced a Western racial stereotype, which then made its way into anthropology textbooks and into popular wisdom that you can still hear today. Eyes became an important indicator of racial difference, both for East Asians and also in the West, but the meanings attached to eyes were different. The techniques of cosmetic surgery were learned from the West, but they were revised according to local cultural beliefs. So the phrase I used as my title, Oriental eye, reflects the label that was first used by Western racial scientists in the 19th century, and then it was being used by cosmetic surgeons into the 2000s. I did notice that it looks like it's finally fallen into disuse, and you will see the phrase Asian eye or monolid eye. But Asian isn't really accurate because it's the eyes of East Asians, not of all Asians. And it refers to the eye shape stereotypically possessed by the majority ethnic groups in East Asia, so Japan, North and South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and the Soviet Far East. Mongolian eye was the usual 19th century term used by anthropologists, but it was no longer used by them in the 20th century. But I did find it still being used by cosmetic surgeons who would use the phrase Mongoloid eye or Mongolian race as late as the 1980s and into the 2000s. So Mandarin-speaking Chinese people typically use the word Eastern, Dongfang, which they will themselves translate as Oriental. Less commonly, they'll use Asian to stereotype their own eyes, Yazhou. Sometimes they contrast their little eyes with the big eyes of Europeans. I've sometimes heard Americans joke that Chinese call Europeans round eyes, but I've actually never heard this in China. I.R. Fernandez, who practiced in Hawaii, may have been the person who coined the English phrase double eyelid in 1960, and I'll discuss in a minute what that is. But before we move on to eye shape, I think I need to point out that Chinese don't even function with the same racial concepts that we do. So when I was doing this research, I found, for example, they didn't use the designation white people. So I betrayed my Southern American worldview by talking to Dr. Zhang about white people. And after I had used it a few times, he said to me with some irritation, "Why are you using that word?" So he preferred to use the word Westerner or Occidental, Qifang, or European or European American. And these are labels also used in Chinese works on cosmetic surgery, as well as in colloquial speech. And then these categories are contrasted with Easterner or Oriental or Asian or less commonly Chinese. So in the Chinese worldview, eye shape varies by whether a person is Occidental or European or Oriental/Asian. And the crucial difference is that Occidentals have double eyelids and most Orientals have single eyelids, although not all. A single eyelid has no visible fold or crease above the eye opening. There's a single smooth surface of skin from the eye opening to the eyebrow. A double eyelid has a visible fold above the eye opening, dividing the skin between the eye opening and the eyebrow into two eyelids. So here are some illustrations of variations of double eyelid shapes in a cosmetic surgery textbook from 2000. And here are modeling cards I collected from the modeling agency where I did research in the 1990s. And you could in general see that most of the female models had double eyelids, and that was because a lot of them had had surgery. With men, a single eyelid was a little bit more acceptable. So the stereotypic quote unquote Oriental has a single eyelid, but many Chinese people have naturally occurring double eyelids. So when I looked at cosmetic surgery textbooks, I found almost an obsession with calculating the percentage of the population that had single or double eyelids. You could find this repeatedly done throughout textbooks. So 3 of them stated that 37% of Chinese people have 2 single eyelids, while 9% have 1 single and 1 double, bringing the total of people with single eyelids to around 45%. Some Asians and Europeans are said to have triple or multiple eyelids, meaning that there are 2 or more folds visible above the eye opening, dividing the skin above the eye into 3 or more layers. And eyelids are not necessarily symmetrical. So back then, before my eyes got more wrinkled like they are now, I was told that I had a triple eyelid on my left eye and a double eyelid on my right eye. There's no colloquial Chinese word for the epicanthus, the sort of flap of skin that hides the tear ducts often in East Asian eyes. Most Chinese people are not very concerned about it, even though epicanthus is said to be common. So in one study, 48% of Chinese people were found to have it. Another study showed that while 66% of Chinese children under 10 have it, it tends to disappear over the years. So over the age of 41, 35% of men and 31% of women still have it. There is a procedure to remove it that involves a Z-shaped incision, and it can be used in cases of congenital deformity, but most surgeons prefer not to remove the epicanthus because it leaves a scar. In the 1990s, I didn't hear any cases of people saying, I need to have my epicanthus removed, requesting it of a cosmetic surgeon. But it was interesting that recently I tried to update myself on what they're doing now, and I did discover an article that was discussing surgery to the epicanthus along with double eyelid surgery. Maybe surgical techniques have improved a bit, so he was experimenting with it. Sometimes Western surgeons mistakenly think that removing the epicanthus will satisfy the desires of their Asian patients. D. Ralph Millard, who later became one of the most influential plastic surgeons in the world, was sent to Korea in 1953 by the Marines to perform plastic reconstructive surgery on war wounded. But he also looked forward to performing cosmetic surgery. He wrote in his autobiography, "Every night during my first week in the Orient, I dreamed of Z-plasties on thousands of mongoloid folds." His first request for cosmetic surgery came from a quote-unquote slant-eyed Korean interpreter who requested to be made into a quote round eye, which, as I say, I'm not sure they use that word, so maybe I don't know what he really heard. So he first gave the interpreter an implant of cartilage in his nose to see if it would remove the epicanthial folds. And this reflected the 19th century Western hypothesis that the epicanthus was the result of a flat nose, so that if you were to put an implant in the nose, it would stretch the skin out and the epicanthus would sort of disappear. But the nose implant didn't fix it, the epicanthi remained, and so he performed more radical surgery on the epicanthus and the eyelids themselves. And he was quite satisfied with the results, and here I think is a woman who's an example of the kind of surgery he was doing. But when he had the opportunity to observe Korean surgeons in Seoul, he complained, "The post-operative results I saw had a strange look. The scar only partly achieved the double fold effect because they were merely operating on the eyelid, not on the epicanthus." And he said, "The Oriental surgeons are entirely occupied with the formation of the palpebral fold." He never accepted the fact that this actually reflected his patient's own desires and sense of aesthetics. He was slightly more satisfied with what he saw in Tokyo, but he still complained that the simplicity of the surgery is tempting, but the results, in my opinion, do not warrant the shortcut. To my knowledge, neither supraorbital lipectomy nor adequate eradication of epicanthal folds is attempted, and for the complete round eye effect, both are necessary. And he called this whole procedure de-orientalizing. And in 1964, he was still sticking to his original plan, which was still more radical than that performed by his colleagues in East Asia. So double eyelids are considered more attractive in today's China. People with natural double eyelids are proud of it, but everyone else can correct the deficit with a simple surgical procedure, which, as I said, became very popular in China in the 1990s. The pursuit of beauty then was part of the emerging consumer culture that came into being with the era of economic reform. And it was also a backlash against restrictions on sexuality and the display of femininity that had characterized the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. Surgeons, I noticed, looking at what's said about double eyelid surgery now, they still do not fully understand what anatomical structures account for the difference between a single and double eyelid. Traditionally, like in the 90s, it was thought that the levator muscle that raises the eyelid in a single eyelid does not penetrate through the tissue to the skin. The fold in the eyelid then is achieved by suturing the end of the muscle to the lid skin at the point where the fold is desired. Basically, scarring sort of causes it to adhere there. This could be accomplished with a few sutures involving no incision, but it was discovered that this disappeared pretty quickly within a few years. So then in a more common method, a crescent-shaped incision is made parallel to the margin of the eye opening. Some fat and skin may be removed. The levator muscle is sutured to the skin and the incision is sutured shut. And this produces a more visible and long-lasting fold, although it may disappear if the muscle does not permanently adhere to the skin. Asian surgeons know that Western surgeons don't understand the aesthetic ideals of Asians. The founder of cosmetic surgery that I mentioned before, Dr. Song, recounted a story, and although he didn't name the person, I believe it was a story about Ralph Millard, who visited China in 1988. And so Dr. Song told me, one time a famous foreign American plastic surgery professor demonstrated a blepharoplasty, eyelid surgery, procedure at my medical school. Before the operation, many Chinese girls heard that this professor was charging $5,000 to $10,000 in the US to do it, but now it was free, and they fought to be his patient. So he did a surgery as a demonstration. His operation was clean, dexterous, everything in the exemplary style of the great professor. The audience could not help but admire him! Exclamation point. They didn't expect that after the swelling in the upper lids receded, the double eyelids slightly resembled deep-set Western eyes, making her appear elderly. After Ralph Millard left, I gave her another operation. I pulled down the subcutaneous tissue of her upper lids to pad underneath her double eyelids, but the sunken situation was not improved. So for centuries in China, the red phoenix eye, as it was called, was the shape considered most beautiful for women. And this was a narrow, upwardly slanting eye with a single eyelid depicted in many woodblock print books about beauties that continue into the early 20th century. It connoted elegance and refinement, perceptiveness, pretty delicacy, and enchanting charm. Because many people in written sources today will still describe the phoenix eye as beautiful, I argued with Dr. Zhang that the red phoenix eye still existed as an ideal. And he said definitively that it did not. And I asked, how can you be sure? And he said, the answer is simple. No one has ever come to me and asked me to give them red phoenix eyes. So the red phoenix eye as an ideal disappeared somewhere in Chinese history, and I did try to pinpoint that. And I think it disappeared at different times in different places, but double eyelids were already popular in urban Japan at the turn of the century, and Japan clearly had a big influence on China. And double eyelids can be seen in commercial advertisements in Shanghai going back to the 1920s and 30s. And that was a port city where West and East sort of mixed together. And my guess is that that's where the double eyelid aesthetic sort of entered China in this melting pot of East and West. So I grew up in the American South, where before I ever met a live Chinese person, I learned the stereotype that Chinese are slant-eyed or slit-eyed. But Chinese people don't classify the difference between their eyes and those of white people in terms of a slit or a slant. There have been attempts to measure it. According to one Chinese cosmetic surgery textbook, 13% of Chinese eyes slant upwards, 4.7% downwards, and 82% have no slant. It's possible to alter the slant of the eyes through surgery, but this just simply isn't a central consideration in double eyelid surgery. So this is another indication that Chinese people don't perceive their own eyes as slanted, or if they do, they don't consider it a problem. I have hypothesized that the stereotype in the West of slanted Chinese eyes might have been in part due to the traditional face painting used in Peking opera. And in particular, Mei Lanfang was a famous actor who played the role of the Dame, or the ingenue, the pretty young girl, back in the days when men played female roles and women didn't appear on stage. In 1930, he toured North America, and in 1935, Europe. He became friends with Hollywood stars, and he had a big impact in Hollywood. And I think you can see the influence of Peking opera makeup in the 1930s movies in which white people play Chinese characters, such as here Boris Karloff as Fu Manchu. And the sort of amusing thing is that if you look at Mei Longfeng, he actually had double eyelids. But when he had put on the makeup to play his role, they disappeared and he had upwardly slanting monolid eyes, in part because one of the ways the effect is achieved is by a tight headband that actually pulls the skin of the face back. And then there's the eyeliner, and the eyebrows are also painted slanting up. So it's a very intentional effect. So, I mean, I think it's a question that had to be asked because actually most Chinese people don't actually have slanted eyes. So where did the stereotype come from? So that was why I looked into that history. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was the first to popularize the division of the world's people into 5 races. He was a doctor of medicine. He was in his doctoral thesis published in 1775. I find it just really appalling that many of these labels are still quite in popular usage today, 230 years later. So the categories were white or Caucasian, yellow or Mongolian, brown or Malayan, black or Ethiopian, and red or American, and that referred to American Indians. And to give you an idea of how influential Blumenbach has been, I found Blumenbach's ideas about race discussed in a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1927. It was a court decision by the U.S. Supreme Court supporting the legality of excluding Chinese children of Chinese immigrants in Mississippi from white schools. And Blumenbach's theory from the 70s is used to argue that these children are not members of the white race. So Blumenbach believed that the narrow slanted opening of Chinese eyes, as he saw it, was intentionally created by manipulation. So he didn't think they were born with it. And he probably got that idea from yet another influential thinker, the French naturalist Georges Buffon. In 1749, he wrote that the Chinese women do everything in their power to make their eyes appear little and oblong. And for this purpose, it's a constant practice with the little girls, with the instruction of the mother, forcibly to extend their eyelids. So this is the level of knowledge of the Chinese that these people had, who gave us concepts that still exist today. And, part of this research just has made me really appalled by racial science. I just don't understand why it's had such a long life. Anyway, so from the 1830s then forward to the turn of the century, the key writers on the Mongolian eye were German physicians interested in ophthalmology or anthropology. Germany was also the world leader in racial anthropometry or human measurement. There was a great deal of exchange between Germany and Japan, as Wayne mentioned, under the Meiji reforms, and Japanese physicians were trained in German clinics, and they did publish in German and in the German language in German publications. And I think in most ways, German was really the language of ophthalmology at that point in time. So in 1831, Friedrich von Amann claimed that he discovered the epicanthus in his article on the epicanthus, a not yet described, typically congenital deficiency of the inner corner of the eye. What fascinated European ophthalmologists was that among Europeans, it sometimes happened that children were born with an epicanthus that disappeared as they matured, but among certain ethnic groups, a majority of adults still had one. The general conclusion was that the epicanthus was related to the size of the nose. In children, the nose grew and pulled the skin away from the tear duct. And in people with flat noses, this never happened. Amann also observed that the epicanthus was often combined with strabismus or cross-eye, which might have been the start of the stereotype of the cross-eyed Oriental. The study of what was abnormal in Europeans went hand in hand with the physical anthropology of peoples around the world who diverged from European standards, a trend that actually you can still find, I still found in the 1980s. So for example, there's a 1961 textbook on genetics and ophthalmology that has two sections under lid furrows and lid folds. A is anthropological variations and B is pathological variations. So anything that wasn't a typical European eye is grouped together under, not normal. Another striking example is the anthropologist Denneker's The Races of Man, published in 1906. He doesn't even call that European eye European, he calls it ordinary. And he contrasts the peculiarities of the Mongolian eye with it. Throughout all of the literature on eyelid surgery, as well as the anthropological writings on the Mongolian eye, the average Caucasian European Western eye is taken as the norm, and the Asian eye is an inferior and deficient deviation from this norm. Philip Franz von Siebold was credited with, quote unquote, the first exact description of the Mongolian eye. He was a German physician and wrote a book, Nippon, in 1832, based on his travels in Japan, Korea, Sakhalin, and surrounding islands. He actually at least argued against both Buffon and Blumenbach by saying that the shape of the eye was not due to manipulation, that it was actually just the structure of the face. And in these books, you get a lot of really cool illustrations of disembodied eyes, which, already just strikes me as kind of strange, because when an eye is taken out of context, it really doesn't, it's, the eye is part of the total shape of the face. And so like the so-called Asian characteristics, East Asian characteristics are kind of lost when you're just looking at eyes. But here's an example of, that multiple eyes, and then he'll put them back into place and show, see that the one you just saw is the eye from this young woman. In 1874, Elias Mechnikov, who was a professor of zoology at the University of Odessa, published another foundational study that was still being cited. This really got me 80 years later in 1950s work by the rather famous Harvard anthropologist Carlton Kuhn. And he was another one that looked at why does the epicantthus in European children disappear, but it's still there in East Asians. And he concluded that the Mongolian race is the most ancient of the races. And so its evolution had come to a standstill, but traces of this most ancient race could be seen in Europeans and maybe some Africans. So the epicantthus in them was a fossil remnant that they then outgrew. But he did observe that not all Mongolian eyes are slanted. And as I said, that was one of the most cited studies for the next 80 years. Erwin von Beltz was another German physician who lived in Japan from 1876 to 1905, married a Japanese woman and returned to Germany with her and their children. He's the earliest evidence I've found for the existence of the concept of the double eyelid in Japan, but in describing it, he makes clear that it wasn't the dominant ideal of the time. Something that I found interesting and again disturbing in my research is that there were many scholars, and there still are many scholars, trying to use rigorous empirical methods to study and quantify eye shape. And the ones I found, pre-1950, who tried to definitively measure it, stated that it was impossible to do so. And there was so much variation that there was no such thing as a typical eye shape. And yet, writers who came after them would ignore that conclusion and cite that very research as proof of their racist ideas. So in reading this literature, you start to realize these writers were not even trying to be scientific. They had beliefs about race that they wanted to advocate for, even when the science didn't support them. And these people, those voices actually kind of won the battle. They dominated the science of race until about 1960. And what's disturbing to me is that their ideas are still being cited, in particular by cosmetic surgeons or people in the medical field who are not educated in the history of anthropology, and so they don't know that these ideas were long ago discredited. So, for example, the eminent Russian anthropologist Sergei Shirokogorov conducted the first large-scale anthropometric study in China in 1912 to 1918. He did systematic measurements of body parts of hundreds of Chinese, Manchu, and Korean males and some females. But he said he found it difficult to objectively assess the Mongolian eye. So he recorded only what he called the very developed cases. And his conclusion was that, quote, the Chinese type does not exist at all. The apparent homogeneity of the Mongols, it seems to me, was the product of ethnographical observations from the European standpoint. And then these studies that were attempting to categorize the eyes of real people found that a large proportion of Orientals had neither slanted eyes nor a significant epicampus. But these findings had no influence on the prevailing ideas about the Mongolian eye. So into the 1950s, the racist anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, who was at Harvard, so he's a biological anthropologist at Harvard. However, he was kicked out of the American Anthropological Association for his racist beliefs. But anyway, he was still selectively citing the conclusions that fit his agenda. And in his co-authored book on races in 1950, he was the first to argue that the Mongolian eye is an adaptation to cold. The idea being that the shape of the eye helps prevent that if you live in a cold environment, there's wind, there's ice, there's really bright sun, and so the shape of the eye is protection against that. This idea has had a long life. I noticed that publications today are still citing it. They take it as proven. However, there has never been any solid scientific evidence for this hypothesis. Today, as I mentioned, cosmetic surgeons still don't even fully understand how anatomical structures cause the monolid. We don't even know also whether the genotype associated with East Asians is involved in a cold environment. It could have been a tropical environment. In recent years, DNA reconstruction has shown, much to everybody's surprise, that East Asians, like Europeans, possess about 3% of the Neanderthal genome. And the Neanderthals are a population that we do think evolved in a cold environment. And they had big noses, and they had eyes that were deeply set under big brow ridges. Anyway, basically, to this day, I found there is still a lot of nonsense in claims about race. Nevertheless, the stereotype is alive and well in Hollywood and Western popular culture. Disney's Mulan is an example. But do note, Mulan has double eyelids. And the reason is that the animator, whose name was Chun-Yi Chang, there was a Taiwanese animator who was recruited to work on the design of Mulan, and she was designed by a committee. And I invited Chun-Yi Chang, actually I and colleagues at Washington University invited him here some years ago to give a talk. So he discussed the way that she ended up with double eyelids, which was that, first of all, the upper left illustration is what he would have made her look like if it had been up to him and not a committee. And he was very upset that he had to argue with the committee and that she ended up with slanted eyes. But he sneaked in the double eyelid when nobody was looking, and nobody noticed it, and it stayed in. Fortunately, because when they took Mulan to, I think it was Taiwan, to premiere, the audience, of course, because double eyelids are so important, noticed and asked the producer, she was a woman, Pam Coates, oh, why does Mulan have double eyelids? And she had no idea. She'd never even heard of double eyelids. So, I think it'll be okay if I go, it's 3:39, right? Whereas if I go to about 3:45, would that be okay? So in Chicago in 1880, F.C. Hotz, who was actually Austrian originally, claimed to have invented what became known as the Hotz procedure, a treatment for entropium, inward turning of the eyelid after an infection. And his operation was picked up by the Japanese ophthalmologist Komoto. In his textbook on ophthalmology, Komoto mentioned that after surgery for entropium, his patients had a clear double eyelid and they were more attractive. And then only 16 years after the invention of the Hotz procedure, Mikamo Kotaro, after reading Komoto's description, defined the single eyelid as a defect and invented the surgery to correct it. He did not make an incision, as in the Hotz procedure, but simply threaded 3 sutures through the connective tissue of the eyelid, as I mentioned, and then removed them 4 to 6 days later. And he said, the young women who have this condition do not have double folded eyelids or double eyelids, which writers and painters have regarded as an indicator of beauty. Instead, they have single folded eyelids, making their facial expression monotonous and impassive. He concluded, I hope that you try this procedure and let the beautiful young ladies become much more attractive. Appearance is by all means one of their greatest concerns. So this is, to me, pretty amazing, like how quickly these techniques are flowing across national, transnational flows of culture. From 1880, a surgical procedure invented for one thing, and only 16 years later, it's been adapted and it's being used for cosmetic surgery in Japan. So by this time, then, you had German medicine, Western anthropological notions of the racialized eye converging with Japanese notions of beauty to produce the first cosmetic eyelid surgery. And it continued to develop in Japan, unremarked in the West. I counted 20 papers published in Japanese on the topic before the first paper was published in English in 1954, and that was by a Filipino surgeon. And one thing to note is that this whole discussion of the Mongolian eye was genderless. It seemed to be assumed that it was characteristic about both males and females. But once it became a cosmetic procedure, it was really women who were having the surgery much more than men, at a rate of about 1 out of 10 are men and 9 out of 10 are women. Let's see. And then when the procedure sort of traveled again, Japan remained a center for the dissemination of eyelid surgery, particularly after World War II. Wars in general really pushed forward cosmetic surgery because they pushed forward plastic surgery, and the techniques are the same. So it flourished in Japan, then it started spreading throughout Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and then into the Chinese and Japanese diasporas in the Philippines, Singapore, and Hawaii. The Korean and Vietnam Wars facilitated the spread of cosmetic surgery. Surgeons felt that they were getting requests because women wanted to be wives of American husbands or bar girls or perhaps prostitutes. Or maybe had been influenced by Playboy pinups, which were quite common among the GIs. So anyway, many of the pioneer cosmetic surgeons were located in post-colonial sites like Singapore and the Philippines. And then China opened up to the world in the 1980s, and Chinese surgeons went to Japan to learn cosmetic surgery techniques. Song Ru Yao, by the way, whom I mentioned, he was of an older generation, and he had been trained during World War II in a medical hospital in Philadelphia to treat, he was trained in plastic surgery techniques to treat shrapnel wounds. And then in the 21st century, Korea began to replace Japan as the acknowledged leader in cosmetic surgery. And that was thanks to the rise of K-pop and Korean soap operas, and that's sort of where it is today. Korea is now the center. So just to return to the question, are East Asians who have double eyelid surgery trying to look like Europeans? One thing I found is that permeating all the literature by cosmetic surgeons, whether popular, academic, and also anthropological or medical, like all the literature, doesn't matter if it's in Chinese or German or English, the three languages I use because I don't speak Japanese. You can see there's a tendency to take the Caucasian or European eye as the norm and the Oriental eye as an inferior deviation from the norm. So this is just a collection of words. Some of these are translated from Chinese, some are not, but you can just see the negative valuation of the East Asian eye and then the positive valuation of the European eye. I mean, you'll get authors who will comment that single eyelids can be beautiful too. But the overall impression is it's kind of overwhelming, really, just the negativity attached to single eyelid eyes. And also the idea that they are a hindrance in achieving your life's ambition. So some people will argue that because 40% or more of Chinese people have double eyelids, it means that patients aren't attempting to Caucasianize or Westernize their faces, but only looking to improve their looks with Chinese norms. And Dr. Zhang told me that his patients usually did not come in and request a European eye, although sometimes they would bring in a photo of a European actress or even actor. There was an operation called the European style eye, and almost nobody corrected it. It was more like what you saw with the Ralph Millard example, more subcutaneous fat removal and a deeper set eye, and that just wasn't the look they were looking for. But even Dr. Zhang said he still thought at some level they were trying to look Western. And the reason was, he says, when they curse Chinese people's appearance for half a day, you start to realize they want to look like a foreigner. They don't say it outright. They say, don't you think my nose would look a little better if it were higher? Don't you think my eyes would look better if they were deeper set? So in conclusion, I have to believe as a social scientist that this bigger picture of the history of derogatory racist science about eye shape as a racial marker, I have to believe that it matters. Contemporary East Asian notions about beautiful eyes and the cosmetic surgery techniques used to achieve them are products of the development of medical science over the past 230 years, but it was intertwined with colonialism, cultural imperialism, anthropology, and racist pseudoscience. And I don't like to even call it racist science. It was, so I use the word pseudoscience. In the 20th century, you had the West wars with Asia, Vietnam, Korea, and in the 1980s, China began to join the global economy. And all of this history flowed together into the rapid popularization of double eyelid surgery across East Asia and in China. Thank you. I guess I can take questions here.
Susie. I'm not completely unacquainted with the European racist pseudoscience from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, but I do wonder, it just seems like an odd thing to fixate on to me.
The eye.
Yeah, the appearance of the eye. I was wondering if that was exceptional or if there were other features of the bodies or the appearance of the people.
It's interesting because my project started out not being just about eyelids. I was going to look at nose implants, for example, and all the skin whitening, like all the different forms, because skin whitening was more popular than eyelid surgery, but it's not a surgical technique. That was creams and everything. But I did kind of, they were interested in noses, and it was almost like they could break the body apart into, I discovered the problem was each part had its own history and its own, theories. And so there was just so much even focusing on the eyelid that I got overwhelmed by trying to do the whole body. But I do have the impression that although skin color was probably more discussed than eye shape, but I would say eye shape was more prevalent. It got a lot more attention than other body parts. Yeah, why exactly that would be, I'm not sure I can really say, but, it was just really striking to Europeans. They just really saw it as a big difference with the European face.
So if you're talk a little bit more like the background,
Yeah.
his background, and he was in Valley Forge in Pennsylvania.
Dr. Saul. I know, but I didn't bother to look it up, and I can't quite remember the hospital. You're really curious, I can look it up. I think, so it's World War II, right? China's an ally, and so the US did have exchanges going on, and actually I think there were people coming to the St. Louis and the Washington University Medical School too. And it wasn't Valley Forge, and I can't quite remember that name. He got trained and the war ended. So he never, but I mean, it was kind of moving to hear him describe that they didn't have plastic surgery techniques. And they had these horribly disfigured soldiers and they couldn't do anything for them. So what he was doing was really.
Do you have any sense that there might start to be kind of a shift in the other direction, like as China becomes significantly more important on the geopolitical stage? Do you think that they will choose to kind of move away from this idea of the double eyelid as being more aesthetically beautiful, or do you think that there would be a resurgence in interest in like the red phoenix eye or kind of the other traditional
Yeah, wouldn't that be
eye
cool if that would happen? I'm not aware that the red phoenix eye is making a resurgence yet. And there is this thing with Korea now where, I mean, they have a whole range of techniques, including a lot of skincare, you know, that is producing such beautiful complexions and then these perfectly shaped faces, which are still really popular because of K-pop and Korean soap operas. So that still has a pull for the.
Is there any variation in the actual, like, the look of the double eyelid that it's going for? Because you mentioned there's like the more American, like deep set look, but then that wasn't what a lot of the women were seeking out. And so was there any shift in like over time what shape they were going for, other like beyond just?
I mean, I haven't done ethnography recently, so I don't know if there have been changes since I did this, you know, up till the early 2000s. At that time, it was funny because it was all about the crease. Like, that's it, you know, like very simplistic. You wanted the line above the eye, and the shape of that line was, you know, there were good ones and bad ones. It should really be parallel to the eye opening, but if it was too clean, that it looked done, you know, like it couldn't be too perfect. And I think the level of surgery was really pretty low when I was there. I think there was probably a lot of unnecessary scarring and infections and complications. I mean, even like the two people that were really close to me that had surgery and it took forever for the swelling to go down. And one of them had to have it redone. She was a model. She moved to the US, had to have it redone here. I think Dr. John actually did that one too. So even in the 90s and early 2000s, they couldn't be too demanding because the skill level wasn't that high. But I mean, I was just amazed at the level of the obsession among women. Even like the older mother of a friend of mine could spot, you know, like at 10 paces, done. You know, like they would notice it. And when I started asking people about it, then I realized they'd already studied my eyes and could quickly say, yeah, you know, you have double eyelids.
And then as a follow-up, when you were doing this work, did you find that there was any sort of resistance to this cosmetic approach? Like in America, there's like some tension between like people that go for cosmetic surgery and then there's like this other faction in society that kind of
No.
view them negatively.
So this was the 90s and the reforms are just getting underway. And there was this blind faith in science and modernization. And it was just, even because I was interested in social class, like where did people get the money to pay for it? And Dr. John was saying, actually, money's no obstacle because he would even have poor families, farming families from the countryside where the family would pool the money for the daughter. And for women, the reason you would get double eyelid surgery would be two things, the married market and the job market. And so, it would be like an investment in her future, which would be an investment in the whole family's future because the children would help support the parents. So it was just pretty amazing, the level of faith. I did think a little bit of it might be related to the traditional beliefs about physiognomy. So fortune telling in China, there's a whole set of beliefs about the shape of the face and what it says about your future. And I mean, one thing that was kind of funny is moles, right? So Chairman Mao had a mole on his upper lip, and that was considered to be a sign of good luck and prosperity and power and stuff. So sometimes people would actually ask to have a mole put on the lip. So like the idea that you could change your future by changing the shape of your face to fit the traditional beliefs about the face and the future actually was operating. So there's a like non-Western perspective that was operating.
Was there such a thing as like functional eyelid surgery?
Well, very many patients would claim it was functional because the insurance would pay for it.
Yeah.
And other things. Yeah. And I think typically they would complain drooping eyes or inward turning eyelashes as being the functional thing that was changed. I mean, I didn't have time to talk about it. There was a whole very interesting fight over function that Dr. Song was engaged in during the Cultural Revolution. So he had already started to found the discipline of cosmetic surgery. But when the attacks on, when the sort of, out of control attacks occurred in the Cultural Revolution, one thing they attacked was cosmetic surgery's bon mot, because the communists don't care what they look like. So they had a battle over form versus function, and that surgery should only be done to improve function so that they can be better workers to society. And as a result, he, like so many intellectuals, he'd been sent down to do hard labor, he'd been attacked, you name it. And then finally he's rehabilitated and he's given the chance to form a new plastic surgery clinic, of which cosmetic surgery was, or hospitals, cosmetic surgery was a subcategory. He starts writing books, and he was just really militant about the fact that form is important and form actually contributes to people's quality of life and their productivity. And because he had suffered that much. Even in textbooks into the 90s, I could see this fight going on, like in the introduction about whether cosmetic surgery was really appropriate on this time. Which is kind of funny given that the population didn't care. They were just totally going for form over function.
So this is a really interesting presentation. So I think here, the domestic, the historical U.S. context, not wondering if you found the same level of interest or detail in descriptions of minority populations. Thinking about Indigenous Americans, for example, the science of pseudoscience of phrenology, measurement scale, and can you see evidence of descriptions of eyes as a measure of
So interesting. Eyes, maybe not so much, but cosmetic surgery in the U.S. also was pulling on a lot of these ideas. Like there's a textbook in 1980 that uses human box categories, races, and then goes on to discuss Caucasian race, this is the kind of surgeries, they'll do, and then didn't use the word, he used the word mongoloid race, this is the appropriate surgery for them, yeah. So that was a bit disturbing because it was published by a Black surgeon from Howard University. And he's buying into these horrendous, racial concepts that go back to 1775. Yeah, so racial cosmetic surgery was a thing, ethnic surgery, it's called. I would hope that, maybe some of you know, I would hope that that's not labeled as such and considered appropriate now, I would hope. But certainly in the 1880s and 1890s, it was still a thing in the US.
Maybe there are some doctors in the room here. I'm not a doctor or medical student, but I'm wondering, this brings up ethical issues.
Okay.
Right? I don't know, if you're a plastic surgeon and someone comes to you and says, hey, I want to look like a different race, and I don't know, can a plastic surgeon say, no, that violates my ethics, I don't want to do that?
Well, Michael Jackson was a plastic case of a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I'm trying to remember. It was the 90s. I can't quite remember if that went into the discussion of Michael Jackson went into the 2000s. But there you have it. It's still going on with Michael Jackson. Yeah.
Can you say no on that basis if somebody?
There's a whole sort of procedural structure by which you interview and you try to establish. But Dr. John, sort of acknowledged that basically you're using a physical technique to solve psychological problems the way you put it.
Or not solve it. That's if Michael Jackson's getting your case. I don't think he helped anybody else.
Yeah. I think in China, the whole ethics, this was just, it was the chaotic in China in the 90s. So they tried to have ethics. It wasn't anything like what you would have had in the US with cosmetic surgeons who did the procedures and interviews that they would go through to try to establish that what you were, well, for one thing, that your patient would be happy because, there would be the problem of like Michael Jackson's patients that just keep coming back, because really they got a problem you can't solve. But in China, I think it was just give me the money. Dr. Don tried to be a little bit more ethical, but yeah. A lot of things just taking money.
But so I'm not by any means an expert, and I'm not interested in surgery. My understanding is like you can always say no, especially as like a surgeon that's not operating in an emergent circumstance. Like there's really a law that I know of that states that you have to provide medical care to somebody that's a follow-up. And it's specifically for emergency rooms. And so,
you're not saying someone's what?
So like, as if I'm the surgeon, then I'm never going to be, but if I could choose to say, I don't want to do this and I can't offer you this treatment, or like you just choose not to bring it up at all, because most people will come in and they don't really know what the surgical techniques and things are, so you bring up what your recommendation is. So I can't imagine that you have to, like, nobody can force you to operate, or like no patient can demand, like, hey, I want this thing.
You want to do it.
Yeah, and so
China maybe, particularly in the 90s, yeah. But yeah, I think in the US that, and really, that was sort of the attitude they would take in China. These are the services that we offer, and you come and you select it and just select one of them. Like, do you want the European eye, or do you want the just simple double eyelid eye? So they're sort of categorized. There's like posters on the wall, and you select one, and they give it to you. Hopefully you're happy because it's a lot of art involved. It's not really science. Like we discussed that's something that's difficult. You have to make your own aesthetic decisions in the course of a surgery. And you can't totally relate how it's going to.
I'm sure it's still time for question.
Sure.
I was wondering about this idea of the racist pseudoscience and whether it recognized sort of emerging perceived ideas about superiority and inferiority within East Asia. So this is a time when, for instance, Japan was, colonizing Korea. There were some ideas that Japanese people were closer to, the Caucasians and so these ideas were forming at the time. And so did this racist pseudoscience reflect any of that hierarchy? My first question.
No, is Japan superior, or Japanese superior to Chinese, for example?
Oh, exactly right. So stratification within the East Asians. And then second question is, how was this idea, if any, sort of really appropriated, say, by East Asians at the time, perhaps to argue for their own superiority vis-a-vis other kinds of East Asians? I was wondering if that kind of paradigm we can read from East Asians as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is where you might find different histories with different body parts, but in the research on the East Asian eye, I saw the Western perspective, European, North American, well, Russian, everybody. It was all one Mongolian eye or Oriental eye. So they didn't really separate out Japanese, Chinese, and they didn't separate out, maybe Japanese have more double-eyed eyes, so they're superior to Chinese. It was kind of a flat category for them across the board. I mean, there is a little bit of, you see rivalries, but I'm not quite sure where Japan would fit in there. People in southern China claim that double-eyed eye is more common in South China. They're proud of it and they talk about that. So, there's a little bit of rivalry there. Now, does that mean they're superior or inferior? I don't know, because part of the argument is that it's intermixing with indigenous Southeast Asian peoples that do some, so that could be actually inferior, not superior. It could be, like if you got into Japanese racial science, I don't know about the eye, something else like cranial capacity and things like that, you might find China or Japan claiming some kind of superiority over the other. I don't remember getting into that with respect to I mean, there's national rivalry over the surgery. Japan was definitely proud of being medically ahead of China in medical profession, and secondly, Chinese people that they were behind. They had to learn cosmetic surgery from Japanese surgeons. They weren't happy about it. They very much wanted to, that was one of Dr. Song's sources of pride about his production plastic surgery hospital to make China the leader.
That concludes today's portion of it. Please remember that on Thursday at 4 p.m. there will be a lecture on the Danforth campus across the great ocean of Forest Park. Dr. Soyoung So on radiotherapies in breast cancer in South Korean women from the 1930s to the 1970s. So please be sure to join us on Danforth for that event as well. And thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you.